Hey guys, so today for our group time, we are going to kind of speed through the rest of the 20s. We're just going to kind of talk about some important things that happened during the rest of that decade so we can move on to the 30s and the Great Depression. So the 1920s saw dramatic achievements in the still fledgling technology of aviation, including the world's first non-stop transatlantic flight. These exciting achievements were made possible in part by bold experiments in the preceding decades. So we're not going to get into all of that beginning of aviation. Of course, we have our Wright brothers in the 1800s and all of those others who pioneered being able to get humans up into the air in a craft. But Charles Lindbergh in the 20s became the first person to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean. So in 1927, American aviator Charles Lindbergh completed the first nonstop solo flight across the Atlantic. In a small single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, Lindbergh flew from New York to Paris in 33 hours and 30 minutes. He was celebrated as a hero and honored by parades in cities across the nation. His name even inspired a popular dance step, the Lindy Hop. So you can look that up and see what it looks like later. We also have, this kind of led the way for Amelia Earhart, who I know you guys are very familiar with. Ian wrote about her last week in some of his writing. I got to read that this morning. And she made her first solo flight across the Atlantic in 1932. So we'll probably talk more about her a little bit later. She came after that. But she was doing things during the 20s, of course. Let's see. Bessie Coleman is another important woman in aviation. When she was 10 years old, when the Wright brothers made their first flights in the Kitty Hawk. She spent years working and saving for flying lessons, only to learn that no U.S. flying school would teach a black woman. So she took a boat to France, convinced a school to accept her, and spent more than a year training. She returned to the United States in 1921, the world's first licensed black woman pilot. Coleman spent the next few years performing acrobatic flights all over the country. In Europe and North America, stunt pilots flew from town to town holding races, air circuses, and showed off their tricks. Coleman became a celebrity, dazzling audiences with her loop-the-loops, rolls, and tailspins. In 1926, Coleman and another pilot lost their lives in a flying accident. Another thing that's happening in the 20s is the spread of communication. So in the 1920s, as automobiles sped people from one city to another and airplanes shrank the space between continents, new forms of communication and media brought Americans closer together. For over 70 years, telegraph wires had bound the country. Between 1915 and 1930, the number of telephone lines nearly doubled from 10.5 million to 20 million. Magazine circulation exploded, increasing from 18 million copies in 1890 to more than 200 million in 1929. Radio came into commercial use in 1920. Radio allowed farmers in Oregon to enjoy the same news and entertainment as their countrymen in New York or Chicago, often at the same time. In 1922, there were about 30 radio stations operating in the United States. A year later, there were more than 500. So here we've got easier ways to hear news through the radio, through telephones instead of telegraphs. And news is moving quickly and all over the place, even to those people who live in more remote locations. By the close of the 1920s, nearly every town in the United States had a, wait for it, movie theater. National ticket sales averaged 100 million tickets a week in a country of 123 million people. So that means if there are 123 million people in the country and they are selling about 100 million movie tickets in a week, then the majority of Americans are seeing at least one movie per week. For most of the 1920s, as well as the preceding decade, movies were silent. Bits of narration or dialogue were projected on the screen, and often a pianist or organist in the theater played along to underscore the action. Americans adored silent film stars like Lillian Gish and Clara Bow. They swooned at the adventures of the dashing Rudolph Valentino. They laughed at Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton, who made use of the potential of film to capture physical comedy. As movies became more popular, the motion picture industry in Hollywood, California became big business. In 1927, Hollywood released The Jazz Singer, the first feature-length film with spoken dialogue. When the film's star, Al Jolson, uttered, "You ain't heard nothing yet," he made movie history. For The Jazz Singer, Warner Brothers recorded the soundtrack on phonograph records, which were synchronized to the picture projector using a special set of motors. Later technology would print the sound information on the film itself. So in the 20s, there's a remarkable step in movie watching. We went from silent films to having films that had a soundtrack with them and had dialogue. So eventually the music would be able to be put onto that same film, but not quite yet. And at this time, all the movies still were in black and white. So we have no color movies yet. We have no televisions yet. Certainly no computers or internet. Popular music. Tin Pan Alley. In the 1920s, as phonographs became increasingly available in working class and middle class homes, and as radio became a staple of American life, the songwriters of Tin Pan Alley composed a wealth of immensely popular music. The term Tin Pan Alley refers to a stretch of modest office buildings on West 28th Street in Manhattan, just south of New York City's famous Broadway theater district. There, in the late 19th century, music publishers began working for stronger copyright protections. A songwriter like Stephen Foster should have become a rich man from sales of popular songs like Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair and Oh Susanna, but he didn't. To ensure just rewards for their work, composers and music producers organized their efforts mainly in the New York neighborhood, whose nickname Tin Pan Alley eventually came to represent America's thriving commercial music industry. So now we've got ways for those songwriters to stake claims to the songs they wrote so they can be stolen, just like the inventors with their patents. Sports. In the 1920s, America's popular culture embraced many new celebrities in sports. Radio, movie newsreels, and rapidly expanding city newspapers provided plenty of publicity for sports figures, which led to an unprecedented number of American athletic heroes. Helen Willis did not lose a set of tennis in singles play between 1926 and 1932, winning the French, United States, and Wimbledon Open tournaments at least 4 times each. A pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, Babe Ruth, was sold to the New York Yankees in 1920 and swiftly became baseball's all-time long ball legend. Converted into an outfielder, he hit 59 home runs the next year. The Sultan of SWAT finished his career with 714 home runs. The Babe was also the highest paid baseball player of the era, earning more than $1 million during his athletic career. But he made even more money away from the game. Ruth was the first professional athlete to have an agent who arranged lucrative guest appearances, vaudeville tours, and barnstorming home run derbies in the off-season. Ruth endorsed fishing rods, alligator shoes, and Cadillacs. In 1921, a candy company capitalized on the Slugger's fame when it introduced the Baby Ruth, a chocolate-covered nougat and peanut bar. It quickly became a popular favorite, and even today, the manufacturer continues to market it as the official candy bar of Major League Baseball. So Babe Ruth really was America's first all-star sports hero. Today, it's not uncommon for professional athletes to be on commercials, to endorse specific goods and brands that they use or that they like, or to make a perfume scent or something like that. But at the time, that had not really been done. And Babe Ruth was the first one to kind of experiment and do some of those things. And he even had the Babe Ruth candy bar is named after him. All right, ladies, here's our section of the 20s, the New Woman. In 1925, the New Republic magazine reported, "Women have come down off the pedestal lately. They are tired of this mysterious, feminine charm stuff. Maybe it goes with independence, earning your own living, and voting." By the 1920s, millions of American women worked, voted, and broke with traditions that had long governed their dress and behavior. Women have highly resolved that they are just as good as men, the magazine explained, and intend to be treated so. So this is when the American women really started saying, you know what? I'm going to do what I want to do. If I don't want to wear a corset all day under my 14 petticoats, I won't. If I want to wear pants, I'm going to. And so we really see a shift in the overall attitudes, I would say, of women and their confidence and their individuality. And we also see a change in their fashion, for sure. By 1929, a quarter of American women over the age of 16 had jobs, as did more than half of all single women, women who were not married. The work was rarely glamorous. Where there is routine work, little glory, and low pay, a writer observed, men prove willing to admit women to an equal share in the spoils of office. Almost a third of employed women worked in domestic service, and most of the rest were secretaries, factory workers, or store clerks. They faced overwhelming wage discrimination. Saleswomen, for example, earned less than half as much of that as their male counterparts. So what that means is there weren't a whole lot of jobs still that women could get. Most women either did some sort of cleaning, housework, maid service, cooking, or something like that, maybe being a nanny. Other women were secretaries in an office, or they worked in a store as a sales clerk. But even then, they made only about half what somebody in that same job as a man would make. Nevertheless, working women discovered a world of new freedom. Earning wages allowed them to move out on their own. Free from supervision of their families, many young women did things that would have made their Victorian mothers blush. They wore makeup, danced at jazz clubs, and went on unsupervised dates with young men. The flappers. I had a relative who was a flapper. By the early 20s, the nation had given this new woman a name, the flapper. Images of flappers gazed out of magazine covers and movie screens. Popular film actresses like Clara Bow, Colleen Moore, and Louise Brooks glamorized the image of the flapper. Their bobbed, short-cropped hair and short sleeveless dresses became synonymous with the new woman of the 1920s. Flapper fashion swept America. When school authorities in Somerset, Pennsylvania tried to impose a strict dress code on high school girls, the students revolted, chanting, "I can show my shoulders, I can show my knees, I'm a free-born American and can show what I please." Now remember, we're not talking about dressing inappropriately. We're talking about just showing your calves or wearing a tank top to show your shoulders. Remember, there was a time in our history where women were not allowed to even show their ankles. In an era when women could vote and participate in the workforce, the flapper represented women, though not all women, to be sure. Many people, especially in the older generation, were shocked by the brazen behavior and boyish look of the flappers. Flappers were blamed for many of the ills of the era, from rising divorce rates to mental illness. So we have, let's see, this is a 1920s flapper lady. Definitely different from what we've seen in the past few decades with the long dresses and the lots of layers. All right, what about the youth culture? As reported in Middletown, sociologists Robert and Helen Lynn's study, based on extensive interviews, one day in the mid-1920s, a group of Muncie, Indiana teenagers met at a local church to discuss the topic, "What's wrong with the home?" "Parents don't know anything about their children and what they're doing," one boy began, to which a girl replied, "They don't know. They don't want to know." And another girl added, "We won't let them know." A second boy spoke up and summed up the feelings of the new generation. "Ours is a speedy world, and they're old." This was a new attitude in the 1920s. For the first time, the nation's youth were rejecting their parents' customs in favor of their own styles of behavior, dress, and consumption. The 1920s gave rise to America's first distinct youth culture. So we know that different generations of kids usually turn out a little bit differently. This is kind of one of the first noticeable times in history that we have our generation of kids that has rebelled a little bit and gone against what their parents said or thought or what they were supposed to do. Before, speak when you're spoken to, you do as you're told, and now they're starting to express their individuality, they're starting to express their opinions, not always respectfully, but it was kind of first in American culture, and there were many other generations to come, and each generation you'll see, especially as you grow up, is a little bit different. In the 1920s, new media and new technology encouraged greater social freedom for young Americans. Influenced in part by romantic movie idols and steamy magazine stories, they approached life with a frankness that worried their parents. So what that means is, based on things they were seeing and hearing, it made them do things that their parents really did not approve of. It made them feel worried. And that's true, I think, of most generations. For example, when I was a kid, we didn't have the internet yet. That didn't start until I was an older child. And so even then, it was dial-up internet. So someone had to not be on the phone, and this is a landline, not a cell phone. We didn't have cell phones. If you did, you had like one in your car phone, or just, your dad had one for work, and it was about this big. So we didn't have the internet. When we finally got it, it was dial-up, which means it took a while and it went while you're trying to log on. if somebody picked up the phone while you were on and tried to call somebody, it would kick you off. And it was all kinds of craziness. And so we didn't have Facebook and things like that. We just there were some things we could go and chat. We could go look for things. We could listen to some music. And that was about it. Now, you guys have so much access to technology that parents get really worried sometimes. So, that's why now we have to teach about how to be safe on the internet. We have people who go on the internet to bully other people. We've got all kinds of inappropriateness on there that's easy for you guys to run across and to see and to find that you don't need to. And so that's the kind of a modern day version of what was happening then. Only it was more of their behavior and their decisions than what is so easily accessible nowadays. But what we worry about for you guys is different than what our parents had to worry about for us. Our parents had to worry about us, if we were running around the neighborhood and we weren't back by dark, then they had to worry about us, that kind of thing. And you guys, we've got to worry about what you're looking at when you're on your tablet or who you're texting on your phone. And so each generation has its different challenges. Let's see. All right, we're going to skip forward a little bit to the Jazz Age. For the post-war young generation, the music of choice was jazz, a vibrant new American music that got its start in the cultural melting pot of New Orleans. There, African American musicians mixed African rhythms with European musical traditions, the jaunty swing of ragtime, and more. As these musicians migrated north to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and other cities, they took jazz with them. Jazz musicians often improvised on popular melodies, infusing the music with the freshness and spontaneity of unfettered personal expression. We're going to skip some of this too. We've got some famous people who appear in here. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. He was a writer. And then we've got Ernest Hemingway is mentioned in here. If you've been to Key West, maybe you've seen Ernest Hemingway's house. I've been there. He's a very famous writer. We're going to skip some of that. We've got modernization in art and literature. We've got a rise in, no, not a rise. We have a rise and a fall in European immigrants. I've got a chart right here. And you can see here's here's 1920. And so we have very little immigration, and then it kind of shoots back up. And then it starts to fall again before the 30s. Part of that has to do, of course, with the World War that we fought. There were mixed feelings on both sides about how Europeans and Americans kind of felt about each other. Those who had fought against each other, it made a little bit of a hard time. Okay, the next one, we're going to skip to Prohibition. Prohibition is the banning of making, selling, or using alcohol drink. The Prohibition movement had its roots in the temperance movement of the early 19th century. In the Progressive era, support for Prohibition increased among middle-class women who hoped to clean up vice in the cities. Many rural and small-town Protestants also championed Prohibition as a moral cause, a way to replace immoral and disruptive behavior with sobriety and restraint. So basically, a lot of people felt that too many Americans were drinking too much alcohol, and it was causing crime, it was causing bad things to happen, and so they were trying to do away with that. Prohibitionists, hoping to use the power of the central government to enforce social order, agitated for a constitutional amendment to ban the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Over opposition from labor and immigrant groups, in 1917, Congress adopted the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment outlawed the manufacture, sale, transportation, importation, or exportation of alcoholic beverages. The states ratified the amendment in January 1919. Congress then passed the Volstead Act, which allowed for enforcement of the 18th Amendment by imposing penalties on producers and sellers of liquor. And notice this is the 18th Amendment, and women got the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. So this is happening around the same time that our women are trying to get the right to vote. So that went on for a while, and we did have our bootleggers. Our bootleggers were our people who broke the law and decided to make and sell that liquor anyway. And finally, in 1933, Prohibition ended with the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which basically just deleted that. So they went for 13 years in Prohibition, and by 1933, that was banned. So just a few things. This is where we start to see again the Ku Klux Klan kind of starts making a comeback, and they're targeting not only Black people, but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. So it's called the New Ku Klux Klan. They kind of started around 1915, and they wanted 100% purebred Americans. So basically anybody who was different is somebody that they would target. By 1925, the Klan had attracted an estimated 5 million members, mostly from the South, Southwest, and Midwest. Although sometimes dismissed as a band of backwoods extremists, the Klan proved as popular in the city as in the country, with large followings in Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, Detroit, and Atlanta. It counted many businessmen, professionals, and ministers among its members. The broad appeal of the Ku Klux Klan revealed just how many Americans were troubled by the changes in American society and how willing they were to blame immigrants and others associated with un-American ways.